Tonight's guest also revels in playing with invisible forces, not algorithms, I don't think, but gravity and motion. His influences include John Cage's writing and music, Robert Rauschenberg's early work, and the art of Marcel Duchamp. But is he an artist, a designer, or an architect? Allan Wexler has straddled all these categories with finesse, and indeed, such labels seem so reductive when you look at his work, and perhaps more importantly, his process. Allan and his wife and artistic collaborator Ellen are friends and neighbors of our department, and often here on Tuesday evenings. So when several months ago he mentioned to me that he had a new book coming out, and some of you may have seen it, and dropped it off, I was really unprepared for the mind-blowing experience it is to look at absurd thinking between art and design, the title of the monograph published by Leir Prize. It's a book that really grabs you by the lapels. And Allan's oeuvre, you'll see, is wonderfully smart, humorous, and provocative, and sometimes has that magical quality of allowing the viewer to suspend belief, a kind of absurdity that is refreshing and often delightful. The subject of Allan's work is the built environment, and he creates drawings, multimedia objects, images, and installations that alter perceptions of domestic activities. He investigates eating, bathing, sitting, and socializing, and turns these everyday activities into ritual and theater. Allan is a recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship in 2016, is a fellow of the American Academy in Rome, and a winner of both the Chrysler Award for Design Innovation and the Henry J. Leir Prize from the Jewish Museum. He is represented by the Ronald Feldman Gallery in New York and has had numerous international and national solo exhibitions. He also teaches at that school down the street, Parsons. We are thrilled to invite him to the podium this evening. Allan, please come up.
Thanks. So what you're looking at is a Vitra design chair and miniature books. A lot of my work has to do with the scale inversion between the reality of model and the reality of non-models. This is a quote by Albert Einstein. But when I told Lars Mueller that I wanted to include this quote, if at first the idea is not absurd, then there's no use for it, he said, "Allan, that's so corny. You can't use a quote by Albert Einstein in your book." So it's not in the book, but that was the generator. Thanks to my wife and partner and collaborator on a lot of these projects, Allan Wexler's in the audience. She came up with the title, which I really like, and I think Lars really liked the title a lot, because, of course, it is about pushing ideas to their logical absurdity. I always tell my students, and right now I'm teaching in the MFA Interior Design program, and during this other spring semester I teach undergraduate product design. Most of my career I taught architecture. So I always tell my students that if you think your idea is a great idea, imagine it's mediocre. Now push it either to the left or to the right or to the hot or to the cold or to the red or to the green. And then once you get it to the extreme, reestablish it as a midpoint and assume it's mediocre and try pushing it again. Because oftentimes young designers don't understand what that term, when you hear it in crits, push your idea further, what that means, and that's what I mean. At art events and dinner parties, I find myself confronted with the typical question, what kind of work do you do? This question has always been a source of confusion for me personally. It is a question I ask myself each morning. It got to the point where I found myself evading strangers or avoiding parties altogether. To resolve this awkward cocktail party situation, I drafted 20 different responses and printed them as business cards. I keep them in my wallet and hand them out whenever the question arises. Allan Wexler, cocktail party response number 14. What kind of work do you do? I'm an architect in an artist's body. My studio is a laboratory. I sculpt with gravity and paint with rain. The smell of wood, the texture of stone, and the sound of the door against frame inspire me. I saw, drill, and chisel in order to become physically exhausted at the same rate that I become intellectually exhausted. The work looks at simple things. Sight lines between seated people, the way that two bricks intersect, the line between inside and outside. I invent ways to walk through walls. I build anti-gravity machines. So the book is broken up into 4 chapters: abstractions, landscape, private space, and public places. I mean, I could have categorized it in a lot of different ways, but this is how we chose to categorize it. The chapter breaks always have a little uninteresting, well, not uninteresting, a small sketch that introduces the next chapter. So I'm going to start with the category of abstraction. So when I first came to New York City, I had a very small studio space. It was basically the corner of an apartment at 615 Hudson Street on the 2nd floor. I had a table about this big. And I thought, could I make buildings that are small that could make great impact? Could I work very small? Could I work in a kind of stream of consciousness fashion, in a very much like a James Joycean stream of consciousness? Could I make buildings without hesitation, like a Sumi watercolor painter who has to work without hesitation, otherwise the ink will tear the rice paper because it's so fragile. So I wanted to think about how I could make buildings that accreted out of my subconscious. So what I did is I built a miniature lumberyard, which includes sheets of plywood, glass, 2x4s, sheetrock, concrete panels, bottle of Elmer's glue, a tweezer, and an X-Acto knife. And I started accreting these buildings without hesitation, without thinking about it. So these are a few of the many examples of building buildings using only 8-foot-long uncut 2x4s at miniature lumberyard scale. And as Molly had suggested, I was greatly influenced at this time by John Cage's idea of chance operations and throwing the I Ching to make sound. I thought, could I use a similar technique, setting up a very rigorous set of boundaries and restrictions and rules through which I can create illogic. So logical systems to create illogic, time-based, material-based, and tool-based is the way I was working back in the 70s. A series which I changed one variable at a time, like the scientific method. I introduced, instead of 2x4s, I then introduced sheets of plywood, and then see what happens. And then I would go through the same process after I exhausted myself of 2x4 and plywood studies. I would then change one variable, and I said, what would happen if I use concrete panels? And then undergo the same process. Almost a building a day. And then one on the left, glass and 2x4s. The one on the right, before we had a thing called AutoCAD, or even computers, maybe we had big giant computers that took the space of this room, I tried to make drawings without, like a machine. So I made little rubber stamps of 2x4s in their 6 orthogonal positions. And I rubber stamped drawings to try to break through preconceptions as to the way a building should be built, to work in a almost a mindfully mindless fashion. Many years later, in this category of abstraction, it could have been in another category probably, I wanted to return to an earlier project, which I'll get to in a second, called Chair a Day. I did a series of transformations of the standard IKEA chair called the Stefan chair. This is one example of a Stefan chair that I burned in a bonfire. A piece of charcoal broke off the chair, and I used that piece of charcoal to make an axonometric drawing of the burned chair. About this time, maybe a little bit earlier, I wanted to see if I could make a painting or make a drawing of a chair that I could sit on. I wanted to be able to sit on a drawing. I wanted to be able to sit on a painting. Unlike Magritte's, this is not a pipe, which you couldn't smoke. I wanted to make a painting of a pipe that you could actually smoke, that kind of thing. So I said, could I make a chair and a painting that would function as a painting and then also structurally function as a chair that would support my weight? So the painting on the upper left is a flattened version of a generic chair. And there are many, many versions of a flattened generic chair. I did many of them. We know that there are 11 versions of a flattened cube. There are 11 different versions of a flattened cube. So you could imagine thousands of versions of a flattened typical chair. So that's the chair. The yellow, if I cut that yellow canvas away and reverse the canvas, you see the stretchers on the other side of the canvas. Those stretchers are triangulated. The canvas is used as a hinge, laminated to the wood stretchers. So you could fold that sculpture on the right and turn it into a functional chair. So this is a kind of example. All of my work is this example of work that tries to ride that edge between the fine arts and the applied arts, between function and poetry, between physics and metaphysics, between architecture and sculpture. So this is an example of my work, which I've always tried to be right on that edge between those two fields. This is a project I did for a place called the Southeastern Center for Contemporary Art in Winston-Salem. I had delivered to the site 96 hollow core doors from Home Depot, framed doors, hollow core doors. We then made clusters of 4 doors, and so this is a cluster of 4 doors, 4 doors, 4 doors, 4 doors. By opening a door and pinning it at the top of the frame, either open or closed, this binary idea, that's why there's a photograph of a hinge, open or closed, for me, a very important decision, like Morse code, like any binary system. You have an infinite amount of possible configurations of this maze. So each week, the staff at the Art Center reposition the doors according to my I call that switch diagrams, either open or closed, and in order for you to have a changing maze each time you would come back to the Art Center. This is a project which I would call a kind of looking at the infraordinary, as George Perec talks about. I recently discovered Species of Spaces, and I became a Perec fanatic. But looking very closely at things is something that I've returned to over and over throughout my career. So for me, I don't know if you can see that, that's the head of a sheetrock screw. And it actually is the end paper of the book, which is a full-size full-size photograph of sheetrock screws on a drywall with extended pencil lines coming through the head of the cross of the sheetrock screw. So when you look closely, you're looking at the biological, the microscopic. But then the room that is built with sheetrock on the interior and a grid of drywall screws 8 inches on center, studs 16 inches on center, the lines of the head of the sheetrock screw are extended to the edges of the wall. So for me, with my past in architecture and building, the head of a sheetrock screw has enormous implications, and it becomes astronomical. Back to Stefan chairs. So I went to IKEA there was a summer a few years ago that I wanted to recreate a project called Chair a Day. And I thought, what would happen? Did Chair a Day in 1988. This is, I can't see the date on here. 2007, so it's many years later. I said, I think if I return to Chair a Day and make 16 chairs in 16 days, I could compare the chairs I did when I was younger and the chairs I did when I was older. But there was a big sale at IKEA of Stefan chairs, and I couldn't pass them up. So I filled up our car with IKEA flat-pack Stefan chairs, brought them back to my studio, made an axonometric drawing of the IKEA chair, Xeroxed it 100 times, and started to manipulate the Xerox and transform the Xerox page. I've tried to forget the name of the thing one sees. What's that book? The name of the, by Robert Irwin? The name, seeing is forgetting the name of the thing one sees. So if we forget that that's a chair, it's not a chair, it's only graphite or carbon on a sheet of 8.5 by 11 white bond paper. I can do anything to that piece of paper. I can violate, I can scratch it with an X-Acto knife. I can cut elements out of it. I can add color to it with Prismacolor pencils. I can duplicate it and glue it on top of each other. So I did a series of these transformations of the Xeroxes. And I think these are 54 studies for a Stefan chair. I then said, now wait a minute. In fact, it is a chair. It is a proposal for a chair. Could I then take some of these, which were formerly abstract lines on a piece of paper, and I didn't think about the chairness of them, could I return to those chairs and start building some of those transformed drawings? So these are a few of the 25 transformed Stefan chairs that were done in 2007 based on those drawings. So they're interpretations of a flat drawing into a three-dimensional functional chair. And based on the same concept of breaking through preconceptions, if I gave myself a time limit and tool limit and material limit, then I didn't have to think about that for the rest of the day. Already it was determined. Get a sheet of plywood, make a chair by the end of the day. I couldn't justify anything out of existence. I didn't care whether it was a good chair or a bad chair. I had to do a chair a day for 16 days. Everything is okay. It wasn't about quality, it was only about quantity and time. So the chair on the left, which I used to call a chair in memory of Charles and Ray Eames, but now I call it chair in memory of Alvar Aalto. I think it's more closely related to that beautiful Aalto chair, which is this beautiful sheet of draped plywood over a frame. I wanted to be able to drape a sheet of 1/4-inch plywood over an orthogonal rectilinear frame. So what I did is early in the morning, this was on the North Fork of Long Island, where Ellen and I have a summer house and studio. Hot summer day, I take a sheet of plastic, big sheet of polyethylene plastic. I wrap a piece of plywood in plastic. I put water inside. I let it bake in the sun all day, building up steam and heat. And at the end of the day, I've got 1 hour to go before the end of the day. I figured, well, I'm going to drape this piece of plywood over this beautiful, simple frame. And of course, it didn't work. And I love when things don't work. And I try to exploit bad craftsmanship. And I try to be naive, intentionally so. And it didn't bend. So I took the sheet of plywood. I placed bricks under it strategically. And I drove my car over the plywood. So I call this broken plywood chair now in memory of Alvar Aalto. The one on the next one up on the upper right hand, this one over here, is a bad mortise and tenon job. A mortise and tenon is a square peg in a square hole. And it's a really wonderful joinery technique used by fine cabinet makers. By no means am I a fine cabinet maker, I'm a carpenter. So I chiseled the square holes. The legs wobbled like hell, and I took wedges and I forced them into the gaps in the legs of the chair to strengthen the chair. And that chair, for me, is much more a demonstration of forces in nature and structure and gravity than if I was an expert cabinet maker and I hid all that joinery. If you see a nice, bridge construction, you see how when a vertical and a horizontal meet, that joint is beefed up with a beautiful gusset plate, and you understand structure. But sometimes those things get hidden, and we get better and better at craft. Sometimes we lose it. So always return and say, can I become a beginner again? And I always try to get my students to, once you become an expert at something, to not forget what it was like when you were a beginner and you made discoveries that were awesome and memorable and thrilling. And you become so good at things, and I think it would be the same thing in writing. You become so good at writing that sometimes you want to tweak it and mess with it and maybe change a system or try another technique. Maybe write, instead of using computer, write with an old typewriter, or write with a crow quill pen, or try changing the tool, and it might change your, you probably, well, with writers maybe not, but when I'm making work and I listen to music, if I change the music, it will change my work. The dilemma of the digital versus the analog. When architects make brick walls in the computer through AutoCAD or Rhino or sophisticated computer programs, it's effortless. You could render a brick wall so easily. You don't feel like we used to make models and drawings where you had to actually draw every single brick. So it was an effort. So you thought twice about how you would lay those bricks through drawing. With digital tools, you sometimes lose the understanding of the making. I love the computer, of course, we all do, but we have to remind ourselves, the hand also has to enter into the equation, I think. So what I did here is I made a brick that's a mouse. And in Photoshop, these are called palettes in Photoshop. Like you have the brush palette, you have the different palettes, the brush and the pen tools palette and all of those. But in lumber yards, when you buy bricks, you buy a palette of bricks. And so I love that the lumber yard and Photoshop are equivalent. So I made a palette of bricks in this position and this position, and I have to, with my brick, lift up this heavy mouse, move one brick into the screen at a time, and it's heavy. So you got to place it really, and then you got to place the next one. So it takes about the same amount of time to build a virtual digital brick wall as it would to lay an actual brick wall. And at the end of the day, you're sweating and your hands are blistered and you feel like, wow, now I'm ready to have a beer. And I'm exhausted. Sometimes I like the equivalency of being exhausted at the end of the day, physically exhausted and intellectually exhausted. I think otherwise there's a slippage that I don't like. So here's an old book called How to Lay a Brick Wall. And there's me with my brick wall. And the last page of Abstractions is a project, one of the earliest ones in the book, which is a rubber T-square, made as my thesis project at Rhode Island School of Design, where I graduated from the School of Architecture, never having designed a building. Very proud of that. They did try to flunk me out, but I did end up graduating with an honors or award. But when you draw a straight line in plan, and if some of you are older, you might remember these things are called T-squares. We don't use them anymore. But when you draw a straight line in plan, that doesn't mean a straight line. It's not just a straight extruded line in 3 dimensions. It could be infinite amount of things. So I'm just trying to remind people that a straight line in plan can be interpreted in so many different ways. But also I was being a little tongue-in-cheek and ironic, and I was playing with the profession of architecture, which I had a love-hate affair with. And one of the essays in the book by Michela Calzavara, he says, Allan Wexler harasses architecture. And I love that statement. There are 2 other essays in the book. One is by Patty Phillips. I don't know if you know, she's a wonderful writer, and she just finished curating and writing a book on Meryl Euclides at the Queen's Museum. She's had actually done the first review of my show that I ever had at Feldman Gallery. And I didn't even know what a review was because I came out of architecture and I showed my work at Feldman. She wrote a review in Art Forum. And many years later, when we taught together at Parsons, she said, oh, yeah, oh, it's so nice to meet you. I wrote a review. What's a review? I didn't know what that meant, coming out of architecture school. So, and the other essay in the book is by Sean Anderson, who I know has spoken here, who is one of the associate curators of architecture at MoMA. Chapter 2 is landscape, which deals with earth, air, fire, water. So over my career, one of the things about the book is it's not chronological. I'm juxtaposing early work with new work, and you'll see that they're very similar. And I think that's important for younger students to not feel like you have to move from idea to idea to idea, but that you can stick with something, in my case for 45 years, and return to it over the years. Because these ideas haunt me, and I return to them. So in the category of landscape, it's earth, air, fire, water. And here's a photograph of me when I was very young, just coming out of School of Architecture. And I go into the woods. I said, well, I never designed a building. It's about time I go to the woods and cut down some trees and make architecture. But I tried to find 4 trees in the woods that formed a perfect square, and I couldn't find them. So I cut one down and moved it to make a square. I thought that was like one of the early acts of architecture. Then this is done just maybe 2015, so it's only 2 years old, juxtaposed against the work I was doing in the early 70s. It's not unlike what I was doing before. I'm trying to straighten nature. I'm trying to fix nature. I'm trying to geometricize nature. I think that's what the role of designer is, or to architect, is to create level playing, to a level surface on the uneven level earth, unlevel earth, and to straighten trees and make them functional or useful, to turn trees into 2x4s and 2x8s. So that's what I'm trying to do here. So this is a photograph of the original tree. This is a photograph of the original tree where I cut into the photograph and straightened out the paper to make a straight photograph of a tree. And then the third image here, which is detail over there, is the tree straightened out based on the photograph of the previous drawing by using wedges pushed into the tree to straighten it out as a straight line. Very early set of drawings done. At the time I discovered and read Gaston Bachelard's Poetics of Space. I'm sure many of you have read that, but it was a great influence on me. Could poetry enter into this field of functional arts? And he talks about isolating elements of the archetypal peaked roof house. And I wanted to think about how could I study just the second floor, just the air conditioning system, just the cellar, just the attic. And so I isolated these elements and made drawings of those elements. I love when Bachelard, in this case, you kind of understand it here, when Bachelard talks about when you're in the cellar, you feel the pressure of the entire earth pushing on the walls of that cellar wall. And I love that notion that in the earth, you're pushing, the earth is pushing up against you, and you're in this protected space. In the attic, it's almost the opposite. You feel like you're inside of a skeleton of a bird wing. It's open, it's airy, it's light, it's floating above the earth. That kind of sense of poetry is things that, could I balance that relationship between the poetic and the functional? So here, very recent work based on the same issues that I was doing in the early 80s here, and these are quite new works from a series called Breaking Ground, where I'm just looking at very simple things. A shovel full of earth put into the ground and lifted up into the sky and moved over here. What architects call, or landscape architects call, cut and fill. What do you do with the earth? And you move it here, solid and void. If you're a sculptor, figure ground. If you're a graphic designer, I'm sure in writing we have equivalent solid void situations, silences and sound, like in John Cage's discussion. So that kind of thing. And then the buttressing that holds the earth from falling out, but it starts to flow out. It oozes out of the form. It wants to go back to nature despite the heavy hand of the designer. The one on the right, an anti-gravity machine. This idea of levitation and lifting the earth into the heavens. I was very much influenced by the Japanese tea ceremony, and then I started looking at traditional Japanese architecture, especially the tea room. The tea room is only one stepping stone above the Earth's surface. And the World Trade Center, which I've come back to and worked with, was 110 stories above the Earth's surface. What's better? That kind of thing. What allows you to rise up into the heavens to create this kind of sacred space? One stepping stone or a 110-story building? I don't know. And it's not a yes or no answer. So this is called Tethered Landscape on the left. And these are photographs that's 6 feet wide, that photograph, so they're quite large. So it becomes almost spatial. I think I get to how we describe those later on. And one thing that Lars Mueller is a great graphic designer, and he kept turning to me and said, Allan, too much product. I said, what do you mean too much product? He said, take that little sketch, make it a full page, and take the actual artifact that you've constructed and make it a small image. And I think that idea of inverting process, so the small sketches are given as much weight as as a bigger project. And I thought that was a really insightful way of thinking about this book. Another interesting quip that I know Ashley likes, when Lars asked me, well, do you have a preference in typeface? And I said, well, I like Garamond. I like a serif because my work is, conceptual, and I like the idea of being a little retro and showing a little serif typeface. So I want, how about Garamond? And he turns to me and says, Allan, what are you, a dentist? So it's Helvetica. If you've ever seen the movie Helvetica, he's featured in that movie. He's a Swiss typographer and graphic designer. So it's Helvetica. So this idea of landscape, this was a project for a study of a hill. I was asked by a museum in Lincoln, Massachusetts called the Decorative Museum to do a picnic area. And I purposely chose a really bad place for a picnic area because I like making problems in order to solve problems. So I chose a hill and then did 30 proposals for a hill, a picnic area on a hill. As you can see, the upper right-hand corner, which is called Scaffold Shoes, is a bit of a diversion. Sometimes I went off track and didn't do picnic areas and dining tables. But it's all about creating a horizontal plane on an incline. And there were 30 different studies for that picnic area, one of which we built, which was there for many years. Later on, the Contemporary Art Center in Cincinnati, 1999, I think it says, asked me to do I had a one-person exhibition. This is before they moved to the to the new building that Zaha Hadid did. It was in an office building in Cincinnati. And they asked me to do an interactive installation. And I did this room called a hyper room, which is a hyperbolic parabola. And I placed chairs and tables and then made the chairs and tables once again functional. So it riffs on the Decorative Museum studies of a hill for picnicking, and then it recreates a level surface. There's one that's the actual table on a slope, which isn't functional, and the others are all different ways in which you create a horizontal set of tables and chairs in this hyperbolic parabola. A hyperbolic parabola, for people who aren't architects in the room, there are a few, is very, very beautiful structure. If you take a diagonal from that side corner and down to the downward corner there, and then you go from that corner down to this corner, and you just take floor joists and come across, they're all straight lines. Everything in that architectural space is straight, but when you sheet it over, it creates a saddle curve, which is a convex and concave structure that is in perfect equilibrium. So it's a beautiful structure because it can be very thin and no supports underneath. So structurally, a very beautiful structure. So people have the opportunity to walk under the floor and see how the structure is built. A series of small little studies of tableness, and there were about 20 clusters of these. So I would make these little paintings of tables, and each one I studied a different idea, but I didn't know what I was doing. And then later on, I cataloged them and categorized them and placed them in these grids. So sometimes this series, I began to discover a tabletop is not just a table, but it's a landscape. And the surface of the table can be ripped apart, revealing earth and sky. And sometimes the table returns back to nature, goes back and becomes a root system in trees. And so these became a kind of alphabet that I used later on in a lot of work later on. The one on the right, you see the shadow of a table becoming the real table. In the book also are some fiction writing that I've done, and by no means am I a writer, but I found it very liberating. When I had a fellowship at the American Academy in Rome, I didn't want to bring any tools, and I didn't want to, and I took the opportunity to start writing, and of course then I also learned Photoshop during that time I was in Rome. But I was using writing in a liberating way to help me come up with new ideas for architecture. So I used the writing, a kind of blueprint. I would create these hypothetical interiors or structures that I didn't have any idea how I might build them. So I was using words to kind of make proposals for proposals for sculpture and architecture. This on the right is called bucket house. When it rains, water flows down the roof of the house, fills buckets on the edge of the roof, and as the rain gets heavy, if the bucket gets heavier and heavier, they drop to the ground, and then you can harvest the water. I did these I guess in 1994, before we knew about Flint, Michigan, and scarcity of water and the preciousness of water. We took water for granted in the United States, and I spent about 2 years exploring water in a show at Feldman Gallery called Buckets, Sinks, and Gutters, were all studies of ways to transport water, to take water out of the earth, and to collect water from the sky. So there are many different projects that were all associated with ways of collecting water. So the next chapter is called private space. Basements, caves, retreats, and studios are intimate spaces that offer protection and refuge. Some places shape our behavior, some are formed by use. So all of these now have to do with intimacy, privacy. So in that same series of photo-based works, the one on the left is called Sheathing the Rift. And they're all about, going down into the earth, excavating, creating private space. So this spread from the book helps to understand, how I come about this. So this is the earliest image in the book, earliest work that I did when I was a student of Raymond Abraham, who was a wonderful architect and taught at Rhode Island School of Design when I was a student. And it was called Everybody's Dream House. And I did this suburban house as a kit of parts that you could rearrange the suburban house and rearrange the landscape for very different reasons than I was doing the one above, which is about excavation. But this juxtaposition from 1970 to 2014, I won't even add up the amount of time in between, there are many similarities. Here, the way these are constructed, these images, sometimes they're 32 by 40 and sometimes they're 6 feet wide. What I do is, because I'm a builder, I'm a sculptor, I love building things, I love working with my hands. I'm not satisfied with sending a digital file to Dougal and getting a high-end archival print that's pre-mounted and pre-framed. I have to work at that. I have to make it, I have to build it. So what I make a landscape in plaster. I chisel away at the landscape. For me, the chisel is not a chisel. It's a backhoe. It's a shovel. It's a rake. I imagine myself in the landscape, in reality, excavating into the earth. I build little props. That's a little ladder made out of museum board that's that big. And I juxtapose those things together. I then photograph these props, these landscapes in plaster. I photograph them. I have a 13-inch wide printer, so I print everything maximum 13-inch wide, but I want to get something more spatial, so I build these photographs with registration marks. I glue them onto panels, and then I scrape into the emulsion or to the surface of the paper. I then use pencil and graphite, and I work that surface like a builder is working on that surface, and then I buff, polish, wax, polyurethane the surface. I like, when I look at that surface, I see the brush marks, I see the swirl marks of steel wool, of 4-0 steel wool. I like making things. I wouldn't be satisfied sending off. I'm all for photographers sending off their work and having them printed. I love that too. It's not me. Here's an example of excavating into the earth, and a piece broke away, and I tried to repair that piece with scaffolding and buttressing. A very simple project done a long time ago. A chair in a room, if you face the door, is one environment. You take that same chair, face the other direction, it's a completely radically different environment. So, this is from a series called Chair and Room. And then this project, which is a great turning point in my work, if you have a chair inside of a building and a person sits in that chair, connected to the chair are 2x4s from my miniature lumberyard. This is still within the miniature lumberyard phase of my work. Those are the same scale miniature. In my miniature lumberyard, I built miniature chairs. So that was a change in my palette of materials at that time. So I took those 2x4s, I wove them into the structure of the chair, I extended them through slots in the walls of the building, and as a person sits in that chair and moves that chair around over and over again throughout their lives, that chair outside, because of those outriggers that are extended out, start to dig ruts in the earth outside. If you repeat patterns over and over and over again, those ruts get deeper and deeper so that you're forced to travel those paths forever. And this is where I started discovering the Japanese tea ceremony, ritual and ceremony. In some ways, I returned to my past, in my Jewish past, the rituals of Judaism, and started to riff on some of these rituals, which maybe I think I might have a few in there later. This is called I Want to Become Architecture. I realized after so many years that I wasn't, I always thought I wanted to be an architect, but I realized I wanted to be architecture. I wanted to put my body into a wall. I wanted to merge with the environment. When I put my elbow onto a table, I wanted my elbow to recede into the table and cause a dent in the surface of the table. So this is a kind of self-portrait in negative, and done as a kind of in flat plane. This is kind of related to my interest in clothing and where architecture ends and clothing begins, where sheetrock or drywall begins and fabric begins. So, this is a planar material, this is a fabric material. What's that relationship between those? So some of the things I was thinking about. And then Ellen and I we did a lot of public art projects, and Ellen and I always collaborated on those public art projects. This is one we did for Athens, Ohio, for Ohio University. And we took the same idea of I want to become architecture made out of plywood and drywall, and we made it in brick. So this is a portrait of the non-artist on campus. So students can sit in my body to feel what it's like to be an artist on campus. The campus is predominantly brick, so we wanted to be contextual, so everything was brick, but their campus is pretty mediocre and pretty uninteresting, so we wanted to show that brick is just a pixel. With a brick, you can create the history of world culture, whatever. It's like a dot and a dash, it's like a door open, a door closed. A brick is meant to be held in the hand, and it's incredible how many different forms you can make with a brick. So we just wanted to be a little bit didactic and help students realize that bricks don't have to be these boring neoclassical collegiate architecture buildings that are riffing on the past, that are old brand new buildings. You could do something a little bit more intriguing and yet still work with a palette of brick, which was a demand of the school. This is called Hat for Bottled Water, again, before Flint, Michigan. This is before people were thinking about water as a precious commodity. Remember, water is so precious that even this little rim, so we don't waste that, there's a little tube that comes down and collects on the brim of the hat to collect every ounce of water. It's so precious. Those are empty Evian bottles, by the way. Recycled Evian bottles to collect rainwater. And the one on the left, on the other side, is hat roof, yes. It's fully adjustable, by the way. So although it fits me, it could fit many of you as well by readjusting. Comes in all sizes. That's called scaffold furniture. Each element of a standard Western meal is broken down into separate pieces. Each utensil, dinnerware, is supported on scaffolding. This is a piece I did at Pratt Institute when I taught there. A friend of mine was a curator of the sculpture park at Pratt. And David Weinrib did not have an office. The one on the right did not have an office. Pratt wouldn't give him an office on campus. And he asked me if I would build a sculpture. And I said, no, I'm not going to build you a sculpture. I'm going to build you an office. So that's the David Weinrib office building. And it's really riffing on the Gothic cathedral, where the structure is on the outside of the building. When you're inside, you see this shaft of light that creates a ceiling inside that space. That's a continuous window around there, thick plexiglass that's, so that it is weather tight. And that's called scaffold furniture. That's called Pratt desk. Like in Bunraku puppetry, where you see the puppeteer moving the puppet and manipulating the puppet. They're in full view, but you ignore the puppeteer. So don't look at the scaffolding. What you're looking at is a floating horizontal plane. Just forget the scaffolding. It doesn't exist. This is called Crate House, done in 1990. It was for an exhibition at the University of Massachusetts Gallery. They asked 3 architects. At that time, I thought myself an architect. I've learned differently now. Todd Williams and Billy Chen and Fred Schwartz, who's not alive anymore, unfortunately. We each did a room that would address the coming decade. And I was doing the project at the De Cordova Museum, and it was very close to Walden Pond. And I read Thoreau, and I got really interested in the book. And I wanted to make a house that was riffing and playing with the idea of reduced lifestyle to a small crate that was in fact smaller than the cabin at Walden Pond. So 8-foot cube. There are 4 crates. Each crate contains 1 room of a house. You have the kitchen, bedroom, dining room, and bathroom. Maybe there's a living room too. Anyway, each crate is in profile the size of a standard door frame. So when you want to eat, if you want to make dinner, you slide the crate into the cube, and the entire cube becomes a kitchen food preparation space. When you want to sleep, the kitchen slides out, and the bedroom slides in. It's, again, the Japanese house Western version. Instead of tatami mats put in the closet so the whole house becomes daytime space, here the crate moves in and out of the house. Like a crate or like a diorama that you might see at the Museum of Natural History, what we're looking at is we're looking historically at now. In other words, we're looking at the artifacts of contemporary culture, the things that we're very familiar with, and we're turning them into precious archaeological artifacts like you would see in a Museum of Natural History. I include a can of Campbell's soup in memory of Andy Warhol. I wanted to be the Andy Warhol of architecture. We both have the same initials, A.W., Andy Warhol, A.W., Allan Wexler. Could I make work that was as provocative and edgy as Andy? So that's the interior with the living room brought into the crate, some drawings. Looking more closely at one aspect of Crate House, which is making coffee in the morning, a Braun Aeromaster 10-cup coffee maker, all of the interstitial elements of the coffee maker removed, reassembled, so that we can once again make coffee. So my work is always about taking the function out of function and then putting it back, making it operable once again. So I'm not interested in defunctionalizing function, but I like to refunctionalize defunctionalized function. Does that make sense? The one on the right is a kit for making 1 cup of coffee. Talk about sustainability. It's all the elements for making 1 cup of coffee. It includes 1 teaspoon of sugar, 1 thing of coffee, and so on. This is the same Braun Aeromaster coffee maker. It's that in which every single manufactured element has been deconstructed, taken apart, turned into a kit. So every morning, you have to consult your instructions, and with screwdriver and pliers, that's the only tools you need. You construct your coffee pot, then you grind your coffee, then you add the water, then you make your cup of coffee, and then you disassemble it for the next morning. It's called the slow food movement, slow architecture movement, slow design. This is a project at the Mattress Factory in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And Ellen and I were just up there 2 weekends ago. It's the 40th anniversary, and they invited me back to do a show at the Mattress Factory. This was done 30 years ago, and it's a bedroom. And the directors of the Mattress Factory asked me to do an installation at the Mattress Factory. And I said at that time, and I'd probably say it today to be a little bit edgy, I said, I'm not a sculptor. I'll make you a bedroom. So I played the role of interior designer, which after all these years I'm now teaching. And I made this bedroom in which the furniture moves through the wall so that the space could be reconfigured depending on who the occupants are. If it's a husband-wife artist team and they're building installations in the Mattress Factory, they sleep in this bedroom. Or if it's two independent people, they have two separate private rooms, a single bed and a chair. So the beds move through, the night tables swing around, the lights rotate, and it reconfigures in different ways depending on who's there. So this piece is a piece that's been there since the 30 years, and it's nicely worn. They did restore it, but they didn't repaint it. They just did new upholstery. And now it's not really used by artists and residents anymore because they have a residence now with 5 or 6 apartments that they invite people to stay in. So this is now purely a sculpture, open to the public. Last chapter, public places. Again, a little thumbnail sketch, always to introduce the next chapter. This is 4 shoes with continuous shoelaces. Very simple project about community. Here is Facebook. I invented Facebook. Did you know that? I'm about to enter into a legal battle with Mark Zuckerberg. No, just kidding. When I was a student, I took a silk screening class, and I entered a competition sponsored by Casabella magazine called The City as a Significant Environment, which was about how do you make people feel comfortable in the loneliness of the city? How can you form community? At the same time, I'm reading Marshall McLuhan's Understanding Media. He's talking about the global village, the idea of new technology, cable television to help people form communities electronically and so on. It was an exciting period of time. So I made these shirts in silk screening studio when I was 23, living at 330 Benefit Street, which has been since torn down. And it was an attempt to create community. If you saw a person on the street wearing a T-shirt that said birthplace, Bridgeport, Connecticut, across the street, you might walk across the street, go out of your way to have a conversation. That's all it was. I came to New York City in 1972. The World Trade Center was almost finished. I became interested in the World Trade Center because everyone hated the World Trade Center, especially fellow architects. Did not like the World Trade Center. Well, I thought the only problem with the World Trade Center, it needs 3 towers. So that was my proposal for a 3rd tower. But I entered a competition, the Birch-Burdett Long Competition for Architectural Rendering, which goes back to the 1800s. It's like an old-fashioned rendering competition. And I won 1st place for that drawing, which was a postcard, 2 postcards, 1 tower cut out and glued on. I love doing things so simply. Milton Glaser was on the jury, so I'm forever thankful. But that was pretty exciting for a brand new New Yorker. So I thought about this idea of the World Trade Center tower, the windows. If you pull a window shade down or leave a window shade open, that's a simple action. Every night, there's a cleaning staff that ran through the World Trade Center cleaning every office, every single day. If you look in the windowsill of the World Trade Center, there's a calendar. On the calendar it says on or off. Simple binary action, on or off. By doing that, you transform the World Trade Center into the Empire State Building. To pay for this event, which was going to be a bicentennial proposal, I thought Coca-Cola could fund this with 1 evening of Drink Coke on the facade. So there was a grid and a catalog of different images you could create on the facade of the World Trade Center. Community, 1 table worn by 4 people. A table I had just bought a Bosch jigsaw. People who are builders, you know, the blue jigsaw, beautiful tool. I have 2 of them, went through many of them over my career. I took and made a table, beautifully made. And I took my Bosch jigsaw with a coarse saw blade, and very quickly I cut through the diagonals and made a mount so you could wear them. And why I did that is because of the uneven edge demands people to seek their partners. You feel the urge to come together again because there's a matching set. If I took that table and cut it precisely on the diagonals, you wouldn't feel the community, you wouldn't feel the pull back together again. The Japanese tea ceremony, the host doesn't drink the tea, but spends a lot of effort preparing for the guests. Table for the typical house, or I should say for the typical American family. This is riffing on Mies, if you know Mies van der Rohe's Brick Country House. I always love that project, where the brick interior walls go out into the landscape to the edges of the property and create exterior rooms and interior rooms. A beautiful building. So this is a wall passing through the dining table. This is a fragment of that wall. A dining table, 1 table. 4 people sit at the same table in separate rooms. I do require some communication because there's only 1 bottle of ketchup, 1 bottle of mustard, a salt shaker, and a pepper shaker. So you do have to get up and at least communicate with your neighbors. This is a project called Coffee Seeks Its Own Level. Again, community, 4 people. If you don't lift the cup simultaneously, creating a level field, a level playing field, a democratic situation, then the cup overflows and makes this horrible mess. And it's an act of arrogance. That's Ellen. So look, this is where architecture and fine art, I don't know what the definition of the 2 is. I keep working with that for my whole life. What's the difference between architecture and sculpture or fine art? Is it a problem? I've created a problem in order to solve a problem. So here, there's all these stains on the table. So then what I do is I make coffee cups to cover the stains, to purify the table. But as an architect, those become plans that I extrude to make ceramic porcelain coffee cups. And this is a project Ellen and I did not that long ago. It's at the Hudson River Park. Some of you may know it. It's called Two Large Tables. So imagine 2 horizontal planes, 1 at table height and 1 7 feet above the ground, each of which is held up by 13 chairs, each exactly in the same position. 2 people entering the table from the north side of Manhattan, 1 person entering the north side of Manhattan, the Upper West Side, and 1 person entering from Chelsea have to sit facing each other. They fit in these slots. So like Greek caryatids that hold up buildings, the performers, the actors, the participants feel like they're holding up that table, like a tablecloth as clothing each of the people. The table is an extension of their bodies, and it's an extension of their clothing, and it's very conducive to conversation. And then there's a shade pavilion held up by the extensions of the backrests. The angle of the backs of the chairs are for comfort. But the angle of the backs of the chairs have 2 functions. One's, it looks more dynamic visually. Structurally, it makes it very stable because the angles are counteracting each other. Otherwise, this thing would wobble like that. It would be very dangerous. So by making it comfortable and making it dynamic visually, it's structurally more sound. So I like when there's a reason for things existing that's poetic and one that's also functional, at least in my work. And this is a project that we did for a satellite to the World's Fair in Hanover, Germany in 2000. It's the shadow of a wind turbine outside of Hanover. The shadow of the wind turbine is solar noon on the summer solstice. The amount of anthracite coal in that shadow, which creates a dark shadow that may be a little didactic, it's a little polluting, the amount of coal taken out of the local mine is equivalent to 24 hours of wind energy that's used to make the shadow of the wind turbine at solar noon on the solstice. And this is the Long Island Railroad Terminal in Brooklyn, Atlantic Terminal in Brooklyn that Ellen and I did, which was a 10-year project thanks to 9/11. It was delayed because they had to beef up the security. And what we did is we created this pixelated nature by taking the palette of materials that the architect had proposed for the whole building, which is granite, and we took the balcony and we redid the balcony to create a rocky overlook. And a kind of pixelated version of nature, because Brooklyn is the terminus of the Long Island Railroad starting in Montauk, Long Island. So we have nature, city merging at the Atlantic Terminal and a place to overlook the activity below. Thank you.
I like this idea of like the spectrum of like where an amateur is playing and you're in the realm of ideas and you're creating problems for yourself that you have to solve. And it seems like kind of the drudgery of professionalism is that problems are thrown at you and you're kind of working in this collective environment. So I was curious if in your work, when you're dealing with more like professional organizations and like especially your later work, like the building at the Atlantic Terminal, is there a tension in the work with the people you work with, or if you want to talk about that?
Well, that's a great question, because public art for Ellen and I was a kind of perfect balance between fine and applied art, because you have the boundaries and focus of what architectural professions deal with, which is a focus. And with fine art, the focus has to be self-determined. And with the applied arts, focus is determined by your client or by the outside world or by a board of directors. So there's a luxury in being told what to do. Andy Warhol always said that if he could hire anyone, he would hire a boss. So we always liked, and Ellen and I did a lot of, and none of those are in the book, but we did a lot of, and I know Ellen doesn't like this term, but interactive exhibition design. We started out doing exhibitions for children's museums, Staten Island Children's Museum, the Delaware Children's Museum, and those things traveled around the country and to Canada. They were about certain topics, and we thought we were going to be the next Charles and Ray Eames of Mathematica. We did a project on space, on mathematics, shape, pattern, scale. And where was I going with that? But anyway, those works when we were doing them were really exciting, because we did get to work with scientists and authorities and museum people. And in the case of the Atlantic Terminal with John D. Domenico, who is a wonderful architect, and was very open to us messing with his building and kind of cutting openings into it and reconfiguring the balcony and so on. And the boundaries were great in that way, because we did have a budget and we had issues of durability and safety. But there are a lot of wonderful stories, like the Hudson River Park project. Ellen and I had come up with this really cool scheme, which was along the what's the edge of the water? What do you call that? Not the balcony. Along the shore of the Hudson River, there's a term for it. There's a what's it? Well, it's along the Esplanade, but it's the railing that prevents you from falling into the river. So Ella and I were going to take that railing and we're going to create ghost images in negative, kind of like I Want to Become Architecture in brick and sheetrock. We were going to do it with the railing and have these images of people in the act of like different positions, static positions, the negative of those positions. So when you came up the river, you would see ghost images of people. That was wrong? Ellen, you tell it. Anyway.
There were shapes of people so that they could lean into
Yeah.
it and lean over.
Yeah, so you could look into the river, but they put you in precarious positions, but they were like cage-like. But they also created ghost images when the light hit them in certain ways. The head of the Parks and Recreation for the state of New York, Bernadette Castro of Castro Convertible fame, she said, I hate that project. She was, so we had to start over anyway. But there are lots of those things, and we were up for a lot of like art and MTA project. There's a Arts for Transit projects, and several of those, and I'm very proud of the projects we did that we failed. I still keep those models and maquettes for those projects. But that doesn't answer your question, does it? Not at all.
I think you expanded,
really.
More.
But
on
anyway,
your
we do have that other
professional
side of
relationship.
us, but there's something about, for me, the balance of once a year taking on an outside project, and then most of the time spending it working alone in my studio. I'm a bit of a loner and I like the solitude of a studio. So in that way, I prefer being alone. So the voting booth when President Obama was being nominated for president, and this was a nonpartisan, Pratt Institute had an exhibition of political artists. They invited me to do a voter registration booth. And I made a voter registration booth by using the idea of the folded chair made out of canvas and wood. I took the same concept, but instead of canvas, I used a 12-foot wide American flag. And I laminated to the American flag on both sides white pegboard. When that pegboard folded up with the American flag sandwiched in between, it made a small building that students could person and sign people up for registering for the vote. Yeah, I mean, that was something that I was proud of, that traveled around the city of New York recruiting people to vote. It wasn't partisan, so.
And it would have stopped Russian hacking.
Maybe.
Of course, possibly.
Of course I would have. Oh, well, as Eric said, they require, there's a lot of bureaucracy and meetings and keeping things within budget. And although Ellen is, we both come up with the schemes and the ideas, but Ellen is expert at working with public. And she enjoys that, and she's very good at making sure we make a little bit of income on that. We know so many public artists who actually have to self-fund projects because they go way over budget. So we managed to mostly, do better than breaking even. But so I don't know if that answers. Ellen, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah. Do you want to have anything to add?
I think we have the same sensibilities, but we kind of have different strengths and weaknesses. And usually we would go off by ourselves, come up with a bunch of ideas, present them to each other. We would each hate most of each other's ideas, but we would find one or two that we loved together, and we would say, well, that's the one. Yeah. And so I think it was really fun. I think we were able to bring out kind of the best in each other and come up with something we wouldn't have done alone. And again, there's a lot of bureaucracy involved. When we did the table and the roof, we met with the department of the Parks Department, and there was a bunch of kind of yes men. And you learn about these kind of kiss-ass people in bureaucracy, and they're sitting around the boss. And one of them goes, ooh, you can't do table in the park. And we're like, okay. And he said, yeah, because people go under the table and will have sex. And we learned to say, well, that's very interesting. I'm going to write that down. And then you go, next problem? And you just ignore them. But you have to be able to deal with this kind of stupidity when you're dealing with public art. And a lot of artists are a little bit inflexible, and you have to learn to be more flexible. So we were able together to support each other in that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think because my training was in architecture, and that is a collaborative art form, then what you do is even with the Stefan chairs, you start to you at certain moments you just free fall and you start to experiment with lots of different ideas. And basically the way we would get started is we would survey the existing conditions, the site, make drawings and models of the existing conditions, and then often I would work like a sculptor and start to mess, just like those plaster models. I would just mess with the landscape or mess with a model of the building, start cutting into it and doing a series in which I was very proud of each one of those, as if the project stopped at that moment, I would be fine. It didn't have to continue. I mean, it's always a little disappointing, but it doesn't continue. But you're left with some really, for me, really exciting drawings and models. And I always thought that every step was a final step. And then, if you do enough of those, a few of them will be ones that say, well, this fulfills all of the requirements. It's within budget, it's safe, it's durable, it's all of those issues. So if you do enough iterations of something and you're not concerned about the quality and you don't try too hard to, quote, solve the problem, but you work around the problem, not at the problem, you free fall, you riff on it, you have fun with it, you try to be bad, you try to be edgy and controversial and provocative, you try to make mistakes, something happens, one of those becomes a doable project. Maybe. Or you don't get the commission. Right, which happened a lot. I remember doing one that I really liked, which was a subway stop at like 207th Street, and I did a series of the traditional subway tiles, and I was riffing on the geometry of subway tiles, and they created a narrative through the whole subway in which there were geometric transformations of the white tile. But the local community didn't like it because it wasn't, quote, art. Do you know what I mean? It was too subtle, and it was, it came out to the street and traveled down the sidewalk. I was really excited about it, and I did some really nice models, which I still have today. So at least I have some nice models. Well, we didn't get the commission.
Do you think the function of art is to reveal something people might not see? It seems like you're always kind of like stopping things in the middle of a process, or you're doing these kind of subtle transformations, or you're forcing people into interactions. Do you find that to be where you go more into the art realm versus design?
I think what I'm interested in taking things that are everyday and very ordinary and looking at them, and I think things that are familiar, like a dining room table or a coffee cup, or and exploring what already exists. But I think that's what a lot of art does, is it makes us look twice at what we're familiar with and rethink our lives, ourselves. I think it's about looking closely and then looking far, that kind of duality between close looking and then distance looking. I'm trying to also, I think art and design is I know that word didactic is always meant to be pejorative. If you look at your work and say that's didactic, it's heavy-handed, it's preachy. But I think there's something about, if in the morning when you turn on a faucet as a designer and you're designing faucets or handles or spigots, and you could make people understand or feel the awesomeness of water, that could be an amazing teaching tool and would be uplifting for someone each morning. So it's about awareness, and it's about exciting people and taking and making, I think this is cliched, but taking and making theater out of everyday life. So these chairs are sitting on the floor. So could I, as a designer, make these chairs appear to float? And over the history of chair design, there are many people who have attempted to make chairs appear to float, or to be lifted upward, or to experiment with new technology in a kind of awesome way, or with a beautiful color range of things. The things are luscious and edible, and you feel it just enlightens people's lives. I think it's about making theater out of inexpensive things. Like, I'm teaching interior design now, and it's really a course in alchemy. Try to get students, and Sarah was a student of mine at Parsons many years ago in that program. You know, how do you take something as banal as drywall or homosote or ceiling tile and turn that into the most amazing, beautiful thing, even though it's only raw sheetrock. It doesn't have to be gold leafed or expensive tile. Can you just look at the head of a sheetrock screw and say, that's an amazing opportunity to talk about forces or vectors or lines in space? Well, I didn't want to be flip about not building buildings, because I'm a major fan of architecture, and I could, come to tears looking at a Louis Kahn building. So I'm amazed that people can do that work. I wasn't suited to do that kind of work. But when I was given a project, because in my fifth year of school, it's a 5-year program, the dean of students said, you can't graduate unless you design a building. They required me to take a studio that required me to design a dormitory for a school in Maine. And what I chose to do is, I was very serious about this. I just chose Howard Johnson motor lodges and developed a scheme where the students travel from Howard Johnson to Howard Johnson Motor Lodge during the off-season, tourist season, the school year, and use Howard Johnson's motor lodges throughout the whole United States as a system of dormitories. So I felt I was designing a dormitory. That was the requirement of the studio. I designed a dormitory that was decentralized. You traveled the United States. It was an alternative school. That's why I did that, because it was not a mainstream school, and it was a school. So that set of dormitories fulfilled the requirements of the project, but I was bulging those boundaries. And I wasn't trying to be flip or anti-architecture in any way, but I wanted to think that there are other alternatives to building more buildings. I studied architecture during the Vietnam War, so it was a time when architects, or some architects, felt we weren't going to change the world by making and adding more buildings. Could we use architecture as a language to cause social change? That's where I became interested. Could I use architecture? Could I exhibit my work as an architect within the context of a gallery? Could I publish my work in journals and magazines? And could I make as much impact as an architect who builds buildings? It was just an alternative practice. And it came out of that period of time.
Well, that's all we have time for, but thanks a lot. Let's give it up for Allan
Thank you.
Wexler one more time.